Alright guys, welcome back to another episode of Rod Talks Games, and today, as you might have guessed from that little intro we just had, we are going to be talking about one of my favorite series, and quite honestly what I would consider to be possibly the best trilogy of games on the NES. That's right, we are talking about Castlevania. So, I first played Castlevania way back when I was probably, I would say, 4 or 5 years old. We would first rent Castlevania 1 and 2 quite a bit from Farmore, which was our favorite place to rent video games and movies when I was a kid. And then eventually we did own Castlevania 1 and 2, but we would still rent Castlevania 3 fairly frequently. My dad and I both really enjoyed playing these games. Now, granted, when I was a kid, we never beat these. I was an adult before I finally beat any of these games. But that being said, let's just dive in. We're gonna take a look at some gameplay, and we're gonna talk about these games. Here we go.
It all started in 1986 in Japan on the Famicom Disk System, when a game known as Akumajo Dracula, which translates in English to Devil's Castle Dracula, was released on the Famicom Disk System in September of that year. This was later ported to a cartridge format and released in North America for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987, and it came out in Europe in 1988. It was also later reissued for the Family Computer in cartridge format in 1993. This was the first installment in what will become a legendary series known as Castlevania, which also sometimes went by the moniker of Vampire Killer. Players control Simon Belmont, who is an descendant of a legendary vampire hunter. He enters the castle of Count Dracula in order to destroy him when he suddenly appears 100 years after Simon's ancestor vanquished him. More on that later. Castlevania was developed in tandem with the MSX2 game Vampire Killer by Konami. Konami also went on to publish a long-running series of these Castlevania games, as well as other popular titles such as Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid. This was an action platforming game and utilized a main platforming style of gameplay. There were several stages in the game, 6 main levels, and they were separated off into blocks of 3 stages each, to make technically a total of 18 stages. Simon could move, jump, crouch, and climb stairs, but be careful, that's dangerous, and carried the whip known as the Vampire Killer as his primary weapon. In addition to the Vampire Killer, Simon can take control of multiple sub-weapons, including a throwing dagger, a throwing axe, holy water, and a crucifix, but in the US version of this release was known as the cross or boomerang, in order to eliminate any religious context from the weapon, as that was a big no-no on the NES. As Simon explored Castle Dracula, guys, he would come across many very famous monsters and enemies throughout his journey. Some of the boss monsters include a giant vampire bat, twin mummies, and even Frankenstein's monster, as well as Death, the Grim Reaper himself, at the end of each level. The ultimate goal in the game is to defeat Dracula and end the reign of terror that he's holding upon Transylvania. One thing I didn't mention about this game, guys, just yet at least, is that this game is very difficult. And this is, like I said, not something that I was able to beat when I was younger. As I got older, I eventually was able to conquer this game. But not without many, many deaths along the way. So just a little bit more lore about the development of this series. This was originally directed by Hitoshi Akamatsu. And Akamatsu was a big fan of cinema itself. And it is said that the visuals and the music for this game were made by people who consciously wanted to do something cinematic with the game. He wanted players to feel like they were inside a classic horror film, which really does make sense, as they used the inclusion of some of the monsters in this game. The player character Simon was originally named Peter Dante, which was a reference to Peter Cushing and Joe Dante. If you're not familiar with Peter Cushing, he was very well known for playing Grand Moff Tarkin in the Star Wars films. But in addition to this, he also played a key role in many of the Dracula films throughout time. So, for example, he He was best well known in the horror movie scene in the Hammer series of horror films developed, which were made in Italy but were in English. Most well known for playing Dr. Victor von Frankenstein in Hammer's Frankenstein series, but even more so for playing Dr. Van Helsing in Hammer's Dracula movies.
So, with Castlevania 1 wrapping up there, moving into Castlevania 2, we got the classic sequel syndrome that we often saw on the NES, whereas a game would get a sequel that would vastly differ from its predecessor. We saw this in games like Zelda. The Legend of Zelda, for example, had a very, very different sequel in Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. In the United States, we got a much different Super Mario Bros. 2 than what they got in Japan. In Japan, their Super Mario Bros. 2 was not released in America until much later as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. However, we got Super Mario USA, was what it was called in Japan, which was a reskinned version of Doki Doki Panic. So, it wasn't unusual at all, really, to see this kind of change from a first game to a second game. And Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, was no different when it comes to being an unusual sequel.
Unlike in the original Castlevania, Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, starts you off in a village with people that you can talk to, as my voice continues to get higher with everything I say, and you can buy things from people? Why yes, Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest is definitely a different beast from its predecessor. So you start off in this here village, which name I can't remember, but if you've watched the Castlevania anime, you'll find that the villages in that series are named after villages in Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. As you can see, as we defeat enemies, you're able to pick up hearts. Unlike in the original Castlevania, where hearts acted as ammunition for your sub-weapons, this time, hearts act as currency. You can take these hearts back to any town, where you can purchase upgrades for your whip, as well as different crystals you need to activate the ends of the mansions, as well as different sub-weapons, if you will, that will help you proceed through the game. One of my favorite features of Castlevania 2, coming off of the first game, is the vast array of different environments that you'll visit throughout the game. Here we are crossing what used to be a bridge, which is in pretty bad shape these days. Not quite sure how that platform's standing up. But anyways, as here you see we're crossing a bridge in front of some... I died. Well, let's try this again. Here you'll see I'm crossing a bridge in front of some mountains with a nice river underneath. There you'll see the amount of hearts I have, as well as my playtime, or at least rather the time of day in the game, which leads us to another big difference in Castlevania 2. The day-night cycle. Once it turns nighttime in this game, the game definitely undertakes quite a different setting. Not only are the enemies harder, but they will drop more hearts, or as we said, currency. You'll also take more damage, and as will the enemies, during these segments of the game. It definitely creates quite a different new gameplay element that, up to this point in time, we really hadn't seen in many, if any, video games at all. So as you can see here, we're proceeding back to the forest. Now these skeletons are taking 2 hits to kill instead of 1, and the werewolves are also much harder. Just a little more background information on this game. This was released in 1987, once again by Konami, in Japan for the Famicom Disk System. It was followed up with a port to the NES in North America in 1988. This is set 7 years after the original Castlevania, and the player once again assumes the role of Simon Belmont, who is on a journey to undo a curse placed on him by Dracula at the end of their previous encounter in the original Castlevania. Dracula's body was split into 5 parts, and Simon must find them, bring them together, take them to the ruins of Castlevania, and destroy them in order to defeat him. And as you can see, not even the villages are safe at night in this game, as when you go into these areas, you've got these green zombies just wandering back and forth. Nice thing is, this makes a pretty good and relatively safe place to grind, as not only can you take these zombies out throughout this section of the game, but if you find yourself in a place where you're low on health and you really just want to stay safe, you can choose one of the larger staircases, start climbing down and just kind of find a safe spot on there to chill, where the enemies are, maybe not necessarily able to hit you, or a platform like the one I just jumped off of, which there are no enemies that spawn there. So we're just going to continue to take a little bit more of a look at this gameplay here of Castlevania II Simon's Quest.
So now that we've had two Castlevania games, we had the original and we had a direct sequel in Simon's Quest, which, like I said, is definitely the birth of Metroidvania as far as the Castlevania series is concerned, despite the fact that it wouldn't return to any sort of Metroidvania mechanics until much later when Castlevania Symphony of the Night released on the Sony PlayStation. But we're not talking about Symphony of the Night today. We're moving on to Castlevania 3. So we've had a very cryptic, what do I do kind of game in Castlevania 2, and then we had the classic Castlevania. What could Dracula's Curse, Castlevania 3, possibly hold in store? Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is an intro.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. This is the peak. This is the top of the mountain. This is what classic Castlevania is all about. Now, this is my personal favorite of the NES trilogy, and while I don't think it meets the heights of the game that came after on the Super Nintendo, that's not really a fair comparison, as Super Castlevania 4 was on much more powerful hardware, with much fewer development restrictions. But anyways, we're not here to talk about Super Castlevania 4 today. We're here to talk about this masterpiece that is Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. So Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse was originally, just like the previous two Castlevania games, released in Japan first on the Famicom Disk System, and that was released in 1989. It was also released in 1990 in North America on September 19th, and in May of 1992 in Europe. So these were all developed on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and this acts as a prequel to the first two Castlevania games. You may remember earlier when I cited Simon Belmont's ancestor who had defeated Dracula 100 years prior to the events of Castlevania. Well, here he is. Meet Trevor Belmont, who you may be familiar with from the main protagonist of the Castlevania anime series on Netflix. He's called into action to vanquish the forces of Dracula, and instead of using the RPG and adventure elements from Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest, this is a true return to form to the original Castlevania game. Now, this isn't entirely the same game as it might look like from these first couple minutes of gameplay. This actually is quite different from Castlevania 1 in a number of reasons. So the first to cite is there are multiple branching paths you can choose between stages, a more cohesive story, kind of miniature cutscenes, if you will, and multiple playable characters, as you can choose between 3 different sidekicks that you meet throughout the story to take with you on Trevor's adventure. So you'll see here between levels 1 and 2 of Castlevania 3, this is our first example of branching paths. You can take the upper path to the clock tower, where you can recruit Grant, or the bottom path, which goes to the Mad Forest, where you will find Sypha. So we're always, at least for me, going to go into the forest after Sypha the Magician, because, quite honestly, she is the best of the 3 side characters that you can get to in this game. So I just want to take a moment to appreciate how great this soundtrack is, so let's just listen here for a moment.
As hard as Castlevania was, and as cryptic as Castlevania 2 was, Castlevania 3 kicked up that difficulty about 10 notches.
So as I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted by the falling platform of spikes, this game's soundtrack is incredible. I definitely have several tracks from this game downloaded on my phone, just because occasionally I want to listen to me some Castlevania 3. And in my opinion, the Mad Forest here is one of the best tracks in the game. Although let's not sell any of the soundtracks short. It's all that good. So anyways, as I was saying previously also, we are going to this way to get Sypha to join our party, which will gain her from the boss battle here. Or him, as he's referred to throughout the game. But if you know your Castlevania lore, you know that Sypha is actually female. Sypha and Trevor eventually marry and produce more Belmonts to slay Draculas throughout time. Once again, in this game, my favorite sub-weapon, as always, is the Holy Water. It is definitely the most useful of what you can pick up throughout the game. In addition to Sypha, you can get Grant the Nasty from the Clock Tower, as previously mentioned. He can climb along walls and ceilings, but it has very short attack range, whereas Sypha has multiple spells which she can use against enemies, which are really useful. The third of the characters is actually Alucard, who you'll later meet in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. In this game, he can transform into a bat and fly over large gaps, which is helpful, but at the end of the day, it's still not as good as having Sypha's spells at your disposal throughout the game. So, you know, in my opinion, like, what is it about Castlevania 3, like, to me, that makes this my favorite in the series? Personally, I'm a big music guy when it comes to video games I play, and Castlevania 3 does have my favorite soundtrack as far as the NES Trilogy is concerned, and that's really saying something because, you know, you have games like Castlevania 2 that brought up Bloody Tears, which is an absolute, one of the most well-known pieces of music from the Castlevania games. Of course, you've got Vampire Killer from the original Castlevania, which is that opening stage theme. But, Castlevania 3 just brings it, and it never lets up. So really, at the end of the day, with the combination of the enhanced story and extra characters, Castlevania 3 really does take the cake for me. Let's wrap up this video by watching a little bit of the Sypha gameplay here as we're rolling through the end of the Castlevania 3 segment.
So guys, that is about all I have to say about the original Castlevania trilogy on the NES. Now, we did get a continued success in a sequel on the Super Nintendo, but in America, I don't want to say we were deprived of the Castlevania series necessarily after Super Castlevania 4 released around the launch of the Super Nintendo, but we definitely weren't treated as well as Japan was with some of their releases. But, you know, we got games like Super Castlevania 4, which, by the way, that is amazing. I will admit proudly that is probably my favorite of the classic-style Castlevania games. And we did get Castlevania Bloodlines, which, while a bit of a departure from the story, or at least from the traditional characters of the Castlevania series up to that point, did play mostly like a traditional Castlevania game. However, in Japan, on the PC CD engine, which was known as a TurboGrafx CD in the United States, they got a little game called Castlevania Rondo of Blood. Now, Rondo of Blood is pretty well known as possibly the greatest Castlevania game of all time by a lot of fans, or at least as the greatest classic-style Castlevania game. And it was so popular that it even got a direct sequel of its own. A little game known as Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which people like me would say far surpassed that game. We got a very watered-down version of Rondo of Blood on the Super Nintendo known as Castlevania Dracula X. But you know what? The story of Rondo of Blood, the story of Symphony of the Night, and the story of all those Metroidvania Castlevania games, those are stories for another time, for another Halloween. So let's just take this time now to appreciate the trilogy on the NES. And I know I didn't talk about Super Castlevania 4 in this video, but I think it's important that we also look at that as one of the greatest Castlevania games of all time. If you've never played the Castlevania series, I highly encourage you to check out the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, which you can purchase on the Nintendo Switch, the Xbox, the PC, and the PlayStation. In fact, that's what I used. I used the PlayStation version of the Anniversary Collection to capture all of the footage that I used in this video. But it's available on multiple consoles. You can get that for $20 or less, depending on if there's a sale. And let me tell you guys, it includes Castlevania 1, 2, and 3, Super Castlevania 4, Castlevania, the 3 Game Boy Castlevania games, and I believe there's Dracula X on there as well. No, Dracula X is not on there. Bloodlines, however, is on there. So the games that we talked about today, you can play all of those on that Castlevania collection. And really, guys, you should, because they're really that great. And they're the perfect games for spooky season and for Halloween. Now, even though we're leaving our Castlevania retrospective, we are by no means done with Spooky Month here on Raj Talks Games. We're going to continue to roll forward. I've got a few other videos planned about some spooky games, more maybe from my back catalog of games and not necessarily on new releases. But we will see what's to come forth in the next few weeks as we turn the point through about halfway through October and go through Halloween itself. As always, guys, I do appreciate you watching. You can check out the link to our Discord in the description below. Please like, please subscribe, and tell me your opinions on the Castlevania series in the comments below. So anyways, guys, until next time, we'll see ya.
Ah,